What's up, everybody? What's up, everybody? This is Josh, and welcome to Beers with an Economist. Today, we're going to revisit inflation. So what's been going on with inflation? I just got back from a big conference where I heard Jerome Powell talk. I'm going to give you guys a little insight about what the Fed's thinking about it and what they plan to do about it, and whether or not that's the right move. That's what we're going to talk about today over beers.
And I'm going to take off my sunglasses.
Ready? Okay, guys, we are back here talking about inflation, which seems like old news, but it's not. It's still going on. So what's currently going on with inflation? Well, the February numbers came out just a little while ago, and what we found out is that currently inflation in the month of February was 0.8%. Now, if we annualize that, that is, if we took February's inflation numbers and we had that exact same level of inflation for a whole year, that is 10% inflation, folks. We are in double-digit territory right now. Now, you may have heard this number as 7.9%, and what they're quoting right there is from February 2021 to February 2022, that number, which averages in a lot of months at the beginning of 2021 where we had almost no inflation, right? So it's a bit of a move to make inflation seem a little bit better than it actually is right now, and it's not. What seems to be the case is that the inflation is actually accelerating, right? So the last time we spoke, we had less than 8% inflation when we did the monthly numbers. So this is a lot, this is getting faster, and it's actually a pretty concerning thing. Now, I've just gotten back from a big conference called the National Association of Business Economists Policy Conference. And what they did there is they had all of the Fed, so they had Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, come in, give a talk. They had several members of the Council of Economic Advisors from the White House, as well as a lot of other branch presidents of the Federal Reserve in to talk about this policy response to inflation and what they're trying to do about it and everything like that. I gotta tell you guys, I wasn't super impressed with the talks I heard, and it seemed to me mostly because there was a lot of bluster going on about how much they had this under control, and they clearly don't at this point. Now, one of the things that we've learned in the last week or so is that the Fed has started hiking interest rates again. And so we can talk a little bit about what that means in just a second. But I think at this point, before we get any more into this, I'm gonna need a beer first. All right, guys, so I just mentioned before I got my beer that the Fed is started hiking rates. Now, what does that actually even mean, and is that the right move at this point? Well, first of all, so what they're doing is they are raising the rate that they pay banks on the reserves they hold at the Fed. So the bank keeps some of your money in reserves for bank operations. They hold that with the Fed, and the Fed pays them interest on those reserves. Now, the basic goal there is that as they raise those rates on reserves, that it will push interest rates up and decrease lending. So this encourages banks to hold more money in reserves. And so if they're holding more money in reserves, they're lending less. Now, if you're interested in this sort of thing, we've talked about doing a whole video on monetary policy and what the Fed actually does and why, like the difference between raising rates, decreasing the balance sheet, buying bonds, all that kind of stuff that they do. So stay tuned for a future episode on that. Now, why am I kind of unimpressed with this response? Well, a couple reasons. I don't think at this point that banks are going to be particularly responsive to a rate hike, right? They're already holding a lot in reserves. It's almost entirely going to depend on the consumer's response to want to get loans from those banks. And I don't think that the level that they're moving is enough given the level of inflation that we have, right? One of the main things that I'm hoping to see from the Fed in the future is decreasing that balance sheet, like I was talking about earlier, that is to say reducing the money supply. And again, I think we're going to do a whole video on the difference between the two things. What does it mean when the Fed is trying to draw down their balance sheet, reducing the money supply, hiking rates? What's the difference and what does it all mean? Again, at the end of the day, all of it affects the supply of money in the economy, and that is ultimately what is driving the price increases. Now, the problem is I don't think that this rate hike is going to have enough of an effect on the money supply that the Fed thinks it's going to have. I think it's too weak of a move, and it's really not going to do a lot to move prices, particularly given the now even greater upward pressure on prices that oil price shocks are adding to this situation. So I'd really like to see more aggressive drawdown, balance sheet, decrease in the money supply to really get this inflation under control. Now, having said that, is there a bright spot here? Yeah, at least the Fed is raising rates. At least if you look at the Federal Open Market Committee that makes decisions about this, there's far fewer of them still trying to claim that this is somehow transitory inflation, that it's going to go away when the supply issues go away. There's almost no one at the Fed anymore that seems to believe this, which is a big old positive move on their part. Now, the other big thing is that even though their models have been, I mean, pretty horrifically freaking wrong over the past year, the Fed is kind of relying on them a lot less. So one of the things that Powell signaled in his speech that I watched on Monday is that the Fed is going to start raising rates, and they're just going to continue to raise rates until they start to see inflation come back down to a 2% level, which is the Fed's target. So basically you can think of this as the Fed is engaging in, they've abandoned an analytical approach, and they're just going to guess and check. So they're going to guess what the interest rate needs to be, and then they're going to check to see if it's moving in the right direction. They're going to keep doing that until they get inflation where it needs to be. So at least they know that they've got a problem with the models, and they're moving in the right direction. We can argue whether or not that is fast enough. It's probably not, but I think they'll realize that pretty quickly. Now, last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is why the Fed may be using the language they're using, why they're so hesitant to, for example, tell you that February's inflation was 10%, why they're so hesitant to talk about drawing down the money supply or reducing their balance sheet. I really do think right now what the Fed's trying to do is manage expectations. So there's this thing with inflation where we refer to it as in the economic world as anchored expectations versus unanchored expectations. And so basically you can think of expectations about inflation as a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you believe inflation is going to be really high, you will ask for a raise, and that will increase your employer's cost. And then they believe inflation is going to be high, so they're going to raise prices a lot. And then as they raise prices a lot, that makes your budget more expensive, and you ask for a raise, and then it can just kind of spiral into this unanchored cycle of expectations driving inflation. And the Fed is really scared of that because that's really hard to control. That's essentially what happened in the late 70s and early 80s that made it so difficult to get inflation back down to normal levels. And so basically I think what they're doing is trying to avoid using any language that was used in the 70s and 80s around inflation because they don't want people's expectations about inflation to go wild. Now, having said that, people's expectations about inflation have remained pretty anchored. So if you look at long-run projections, like surveys of consumers and what they think is going to happen to inflation, there's very little indication that consumers believe this is going to last more than a couple of years, which is a good thing for now. The question is whether the Fed can actually get inflation under control in that time period, because those expectations can become unanchored pretty easily. Hey everybody, real quick. So as we were filming that segment right here at the brewery, somebody just walked up and asked me, like, why is the Fed doing like such a kind of stupid, simple policy? They just like kind of guess and check, guess and check, guess and check. It seems like a little elementary for, you know, the central bank of the most powerful economy in the entire world, right? Which I agree, but that's probably a feature, not a bug, right? So right now the Fed, again, they're trying to manage expectations and get inflation under control as quickly as possible. and they have all of these people in the economy, bankers, people in the financial system, trying to game what they're doing, right? So they're trying to take what the Fed's doing and they're trying to figure out how to make money off of it. And in a lot of ways, some of those moves can be counterproductive to what the Fed's trying to do to get inflation under control. So sometimes doing a very like stupid, simple policy makes it a lot harder for people to kind of like game what the Fed's trying to do. And so it actually could work a lot better. So that's a reason to not be too concerned. But as always, we'll see what happens when the next set of numbers comes out.